Hello everyone, my name is Yara and today I'm going to be reviewing my recent reads for the last few months. It has been quite a while since my last recent reads. I did not mean for there to be so much time in between. Life got extremely hectic, and personally for me it feels like that was like 2 weeks ago, but in actuality that was like 4 months ago? Or more, honestly, maybe 6 months ago. I don't know, but we are here today and we're gonna catch up. I also have read so much since that time, so it was a little overwhelming to try and go back to all those books that I read back. Some of them are even from March. So some of these reviews are going to be shorter, perhaps, than what I usually give, just because it's been so long. But also knowing me, I'm a yapper, so this video is still probably going to be very long. So sit down, grab a snack, or listen to this while you do your chores or whatever you need to do. I have 10 books here that I want to talk about from a variety of genres as per usual. We got dystopian, we got fantasy, we got literary, we got YA contemporary, the whole gambit. So without further ado, let's begin. So the first book I have today to talk about is Sunrise on the Reaping by Suzanne Collins. Now, I don't think I need to really go into what this book is about. I'm sure you all know. It is the prequel to the Hunger Games trilogy, the second prequel that Suzanne Collins has written so far, the first being The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. Specifically, it's the Haymitch book, and it tells the story of the second Quarter Quell, which is something that we hear about in Catching Fire, I believe. But here we get an in-depth perspective of what actually happened. So going into this, I was a little skeptical because, one, there's been a lot of announcements of prequels and sequels to existing IP that have come out in the last couple of years that I feel like not all of them have really needed to exist. And what made me particularly concerned about Sunrise on the Reaping was that the movie adaptation for it was announced at the same time that the book was announced. So it kind of felt like Lionsgate was just asking Suzanne Collins, do you have another story? Because we want to make another movie. So my main question going into this book was basically, does this need to exist and what does it contribute to the Hunger Games canon? And I'm happy to report that I did enjoy this and I do feel like it serves a purpose in the overall Hunger Games narrative. In contrast to The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, which is in third-person perspective from President Snow's point of view, this book is structured very similarly to the original Hunger Games trilogy. We are in first person, but we are following Haymitch, someone who is also from District 12, and we also follow a similar story structure of beginning with the reaping, and then training in the capital, and then eventually going into a games. The difference, however, pops up as soon as we get to the reaping, where you realize that this is not going to be the same story at all. And that was probably the most interesting part of the whole story, was that it was this interim period between the brutality and almost primitiveness of the games in Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes to not being quite as polished and refined and set up for TV and the cameras as it is in the original Hunger Games trilogy. Here we get to see just how unrefined the process and the system is, and we also see the lengths that they will go to manipulate the media in order to hide all those cracks in the system. As such, one of the big themes of the book is about propaganda and messaging and how we construct truth and reality and how much that can be manipulated. The theme of propaganda is not really new to the Hunger Games franchise. It's heavily mentioned in Mockingjay in particular. And so perhaps we didn't need it to be as front and center and admittedly heavy-handed as it was in Sunrise on the Reaping. But at the same time, I can't deny how horrifying it was to really witness all these subtle and not subtle ways and the lengths that the Capitol would go to fabricate reality. And in turn, how much that affects the characters psychologically. But overall, what actually stood out to me the most about Sunrise on the Reaping and what got me the most emotional was how much the characters were doomed by the narrative. We know where they end up. We know that whatever attempts at revolution start in this book are not going to work because we see where Katniss is at the beginning of the Hunger Games. We also know where Haymitch is and who he is during the events of the Hunger Games trilogy versus here, where he is a much different person. It was just so freaking tragic to see all these characters so filled with hope and filled with possibility that they might beat the Capitol, and knowing that it's not going to work. But at the same time, because we are getting this book after we already have the original trilogy, we know that the revolution happens at some point, there is also a little bit of a sense of hope as well. Or hope is not maybe the right word, but basically the idea that the revolution didn't start in a day, that the revolution that ends up succeeding was built upon the sacrifices of all of these people that came before them. And that sentiment just makes me like very emotional. This book didn't make me cry, but it did definitely put me in like a depressive episode for like a week. Was this as good as the original Hunger Games trilogy? No. I did think the story was kind of overall weaker. Where the messaging was very organic in the Hunger Games, it felt very heavy-handed in this book. Even though I like the messaging, it still, I feel like, affects my immersion in the story if you are beating me over the head with it. And also something that surprised me about this book was that I didn't always love the way that the Kaveh were portrayed. I felt a little bit similarly about this in Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, but more so here, where it just felt like they were more of an idea rather than fully realized characters. And that made sense more in Ballad because we are in Snow's head and he is not humanizing these people. He very much is objectifying Lucy Gray. But in this book, I did almost wish that we got to see some of these characters or just learn a little bit more about who they are outside of Haymitch's perspective, where he is always kind of kept at a distance. So with all that, I gave Sunrise on the Reaping 4 stars. The next book that I have is The Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez. This is perhaps the most unique fantasy or just book in general that I have ever read. Trust me, like you will not have read any book like this. This is an adult fantasy standalone / literary fantasy that is a little bit hard to describe. The plot itself is kind of deceptively simple. The tagline basically says, 2 warriors shepherd an ancient god across a broken land to end the tyrannical reign of a royal family. These said 2 warriors are June, who was a royal guard who was now trying to repent for the sins of his past, and Kima, who was a one-armed outcast from a now eradicated tribe who was trying to honor the dying wish of his mentor. Together they form an alliance that not only brings them closer together, but also sows the seed of rebellion within the kingdom. So on the surface, it seems like a kind of simple or just straightforward plot structure, but that in no way encompasses what this story is or how it is told. Because what makes the story unique is how the author plays with perspective and with structure. So let's first start with perspective. So the book uses 3 different POVs, all at the same time, which can be a little bit confusing at first. You don't understand really which POV is referring to what. It took me like 3 attempts at reading the first 50 pages to finally grasp onto what was happening. But trust me, once you get it, it works very well. It fully immerses you in the story, and it is such a cool effect. So we first begin with this kind of frame story that's written in the second person, where you are listening to your grandmother tell you stories of the old world, as well as the creation of something called the inverted theater. The narrator then visits the inverted theater, and the story then becomes interposed with third-person narration that is describing the play that is being acted out in the theater, i.e. the story of Kima and June and their whole journey with the ancient goddess. But within this third-person narration, we also have interposed first-person narration that is written in italics, and these represent the thoughts and perspectives of all or any character that we meet in the story, including the peripheral or auxiliary characters that we may meet only very briefly in the story, or even people that have died. We get to see their thoughts as well. Again, it's a little convoluted, a little hard to get used to initially, but once you do, it creates such a vivid picture of this world. I truly was like such in awe of just how masterfully crafted the book was. I was reading it as if it was like a work of art. I was just appreciating the craft. Because Simon Jimenez has big brain energy. I don't know how he thought of this or balanced this, but it worked out so well. I continuously found myself drawn to picking up the book, not because of the story, which was also still pretty interesting, but it was just the pleasure of being in that world, in that writing. And I really wanted to like take my time and soak it in. Another thing that was so cool about the writing style was that it was able to capture so much about the characters in such a short amount of time. You really felt like you got a good grasp of the world, even if you didn't spend that much time with the characters. I mean, the whole story, the plot takes place over 5 days, but you feel like you've gone a lifetime with them. And even with the characters that we only meet for those brief moments in their thoughts, when we get to hear their thoughts as they die. That was such a cool effect to be able to see the cost of all the collateral damage that was happening in all of these fights in this war. You were never not allowed to think about collateral damage because it was such a center point in the story. Even the emotion and themes in the story I thought were really well executed. Again, not because they were particularly unique or profound by themselves, but it was because of the way that it was written. The story explores a lot of violence, but is also very deeply defined by a sense of earnestness and love. It explores redemption, power, greed, love, intimacy in ways that feel so fresh and new because of how it was presented. So if you could not tell by how much I've kind of gushed about this book, this is obviously 5 stars. Definitely the best book that I've read so far this year. Definitely the most unique book that I've ever read. I feel like it deserves an award for just how well crafted it is. But I also anticipate that a lot of people who read this book are not going to like it because it is so dependent on whether that writing style and structure really vibes with you. Because if you are not really able to get into it, I fear the story is not going to be as memorable without it. The next book that I read was Evil Eye by Etaf Rum. This is a book I actually did a whole video on. It is the last video, or should be the last video that I posted on this channel. That was kind of a hybrid review / discussion video essay on post-colonial feminism and the lens through which I was reading this book. So if that topic interests you and you want to have a more in-depth discussion about this book, please go check out that video, but I still wanted to include a more usual review in this video as well. So Evil Eye follows a Palestinian-American woman named Yara who grew up in a kind of religiously conservative and emotionally volatile household in Brooklyn. And so when she meets a young and charming entrepreneur named Fadi, she rushes at the opportunity to marry him and move away to another state. From there, she's able to go to university and study art and eventually gets a teaching position at a university while at the same time raising 2 young girls with her husband. But now, despite creating this new life for herself and living out her dreams and her goals, she still has this feeling that something isn't right in her life. That maybe the life that she has built, her marriage, her career, might not be enough and might not actually be fulfilling her. After she gets into a verbal altercation with a coworker over a microaggressive comment, Yara is forced to go to therapy or else face probation from her job. And these counseling sessions kind of serve as the catalyst for her beginning to truly reckon with her past, her childhood, and all the traumas that she has tried to suppress and have led her to this point in her life. I hope I described that okay. I find it very hard to describe these kind of literary books that are very focused on introspection because not a lot actually happens in the plot. The book is essentially just a character study, a psychological and emotional exploration of this woman as she is beginning to see a lot of the cracks in the perfect life that she has built. I ended up really enjoying this book, but enjoy is not really the right word because I didn't actually enjoy, if that makes sense. It brought up a lot of emotions in me as well, a lot of triggered emotions. It explores themes of misogyny and Islamophobia, but in very subtle manifestations of them. Like, it doesn't really cover super overt offenses, though some things are, but it really digs into those kind of gray areas where something is wrong, but you're kind of gaslit into thinking that something is not wrong because there's some plausible deniability. Especially when it came to her marriage, I feel like it dealt with the idea of just because a marriage isn't overtly abusive or directly harmful, it doesn't mean that it is also healthy. Like I said, it's a very introspective book, and that introspection and growth is not always linear, which can be frustrating, but also is a very realistic and raw portrayal of something that could happen in that position. In my review video, I talk more about her inner conflicts through the lens of post-colonial feminism, specifically how she is fighting a war on 2 fronts, essentially. She is fighting against gendered expectations while also trying not to affirm racist stereotypes about her religion and culture, which can make for a very messy internal struggle through that cognitive dissonance. So overall, I gave this book 4 stars. I really enjoyed it as much as feeling like I was going through therapy can be an enjoyable experience. And I appreciate a lot of the ideas that Etaf Rum brought up and the kind of springboard for discussion. What held it back from being a full 5 stars for me was, I think, the writing. It wasn't bad or anything, but it was just fairly simple. Like, it got the job done, but it didn't move me in a particular way. It was almost too clinical in a sense, and I would have appreciated a little bit more versatility or emotion from it. Alright, so now switching the vibes completely, the next book I have is a YA contemporary rom-com called You Started It by Jackie Khalilieh. This follows a Palestinian-Canadian teenager named Jamie who is about to start her senior year of high school when she is suddenly broken up with by her boyfriend of 3 years, Ben. What makes matters worse is that soon after their breakup, he starts dating the girl that he told Jamie not to worry about. And this kind of sends Jamie into a spiral. I mean, all of her memories and experiences in high school have been tied to her relationship with Ben. And all of her hopes and plans for her senior year depended on them being together. And so now she kind of has to start from scratch. In a moment of anger and in an attempt to make Ben jealous, she starts fake dating her neighbor named Axel, who is a TikTok dancer and with whom she shares nothing in common. But of course, through this new arrangement, she gets to know Axel more and learns that he may be more than meets the eye, and also begins to learn a little bit more about herself and what she wants. So I was really hopeful going into this. I love a YA contemporary, I love a YA romance, and in particular I was excited to see a YA romance with Middle Eastern characters. This is the second book, though, that I read by this author. The first book was Something More, which came out last year, I believe. And I did not love that book. I had a lot of problems with it, but there also were a lot of things that I enjoyed or at least saw potential with, so I wanted to give the author another chance. And when I started reading this book, I was pleasantly surprised. I have trouble sometimes with fake dating as a trope because it can sometimes be very arbitrary and fabricated and just takes me out of the situation when it's too in service of the trope. But here I found the situation very amusing and I was kind of having a blast. I thought it was just so fun in the beginning. It kind of reminded me of a YA version of Funny Story by Emily Henry. You have this girl who's been in a kind of enmeshed relationship for a long time that suddenly gets broken up with and now kind of has to figure out who she is and starts dating or fake dating another guy who helps her discover more parts of herself, in this case, that being her Arab heritage. As I mentioned, Jamie is half Palestinian, but she is not super connected with that side of her heritage because her mom grew up in a very conservative family and really resents a lot of the culture because of that, and has kind of kept Jamie away from it in result. Axel, on the other hand, is also Arab. I forgot what country they say he's from, but he comes from this big family, has a lot of cousins and aunts and uncles, and through the relationship, Jamie is able to access parts of Arab culture that she didn't have before, like going to an Arab wedding and getting to dance dabke. So I was having a lot of fun with the story and also appreciating this message and character growth that we were getting. However, I do feel like probably around the halfway point and onward, more of the flaws of the story began to be more apparent and the charm started to wane a little. There is like a love square situation back and forth that starts to get very messy and very petty to a point where I was not very entertained anymore and more so just kind of annoyed. And while I think romance just kind of has inherently corny or cringy aspects to it, there were some moments in this book that were so on the nose that I could not deal with the cringe. It reached my limit, and my limit is apparently the male love interest dancing to Treat You Better by Shawn Mendes for a TikTok. I fully recognize that I am not the target audience for this book and that cringe is in the eye of the beholder, so take what I say with a grain of salt, but that was just my experience. The other main issue that I ended up having with the book, though, had more to do with its messaging and the way that it handled certain cultural conversations. Don't get me wrong, I think the overall message of the story, or at least what the author was trying to do, I liked and appreciated, but there were some like small moments and certain things that were said during dialogue that kind of had me turn my head like, oh, that was a choice. I go into more depth about particular things that bothered me in my Goodreads review if you want to read that, but I'll try to briefly cover it here. Basically, one of the reasons that I read this book in general was something that the author wrote in her author's note, and it was that she was really inspired to write this story and specifically include a Arab male love interest because the mainstream media has presented Arab men as inherently violent or misogynistic. And she was especially inspired after seeing videos of men in Gaza who show such strength but also such a sensitivity and compassion and love for their loved ones. And so she wanted to have the opportunity to emulate those features in her Arab male characters in this book. And so obviously I was very on board with that and very excited to read this. And so I was so surprised and a little little disappointed to find out that I didn't like some of the ways that she talked about certain issues regarding feminism within the community. The way that it was executed in the book at best came across as lacking a lot of nuance, and at worst was kind of dismissive of real life problems that do still exist in the community. Like, there were multiple instances where Axel was like, actually, that's not sexist, which was a little off-putting because one, he's a guy, and so he is obviously a little biased in the situation where he might be the beneficiary or the beneficient, whatever the object form of that is. And two, it just rubbed me the wrong way because it was kind of putting this male perspective as the voice of authority on issues of misogyny in the community. It just overall felt like the narrative took a not all men approach to battling these stereotypes when I think it could have handled it in a much more nuanced and poignant way. And what's most frustrating is that I feel like the author had already succeeded in her goal of creating very humanized and sensitive and caring male characters in Axel outside of these instances, and in Jamie's uncle, who is like a father figure to her and is a really sweet character. She already built these examples of positive masculinity, and so it's a shame that it was kind of undermined by these other attempts to tackle conversations that I don't think she dealt with the best. Overall, I gave this 2.5 stars. I thought it was an improvement from her debut, but I feel like it was really brought down by overdrawn drama and pettiness, as well as how those cultural and thematic conversations were handled. Moving on to an adult romance novel, we have A Great Big Beautiful Life by Emily Henry. Last year, I made a video where I documented reading all of Emily Henry's adult romance books, which was really fun, so check that out if you want to see more of my thoughts. So now I feel like I'm obligated to read any Emily Henry romance that comes out now for the sake of data, you know? But anyway, what that video showed me is that I'm very hit or miss when it comes to Emily Henry. Sometimes I really love it, sometimes it's more meh or middling. So I really didn't know what to expect going into this book. So this book is about a writer named Alice, who at the beginning of the story is traveling to an island called Little Crescent in order to meet a former celebrity/heiress named Margaret Ives for the opportunity to write a biography of her. When she arrives there, though, she finds out that she is not the only writer who was told of this chance to write the biography. Hayden, an author whose previous biography won a Pulitzer Prize, is also vying for this opportunity. Margaret announces that she is going to give them a 1-month trial period where they will each have the chance to interview her and write a sample to figure out who will be the person who writes her book. And while they both try to piece together her story, they realize there may be a lot more mystery in Margaret Ives' past than they thought. I've seen a lot of people compare this book to Evelyn Hugo, which I have not read, so I can't comment on if the comparisons hold true, but I do know that at least the structure of the stories is kind of the same, where you have this kind of dual narrative, one being told through these interviews with the celebrity or heiress. And when I heard that, I was actually kind of excited because it was something different for Emily Henry. I felt like after reading 5 of her books kind of back to back, I was getting a little bit of Emily Henry fatigue, so I hoped that this would be kind of a new direction for her. But alas, I fear the Emily Henry fatigue is still there. I don't know, I just feel like a lot of her characters and her storylines are starting to blend together. I mean, definitely the storyline and the plot in this one is unique compared to her other ones, but the characters were not memorable at all, frankly. Don't get me wrong, the dynamic between Alice and Hayden was cute and they had a lot of sexual chemistry. I kind of felt like they only had the sexual chemistry. I feel like this was Emily Henry's smuttiest book, but its least emotionally developed. There was just nothing interesting about either of them that I haven't seen already in a previous Emily Henry book. I also kind of found myself underwhelmed with both sides of this double storyline. With the romance, initially I was vibing with it, but I feel like after a while, a lot of the tension kind of dissipated. The characters kiss very early on in the story, but decide that they can't be in a relationship because they are in competition with each other, and that would make things kind of awkward, which would have made things a little interesting if they had actually adhered to that. The rule that they established just felt so arbitrary because they were just like, okay, we cannot sleep together, but then would do everything under the sun and also do coupley things. So like, you are essentially together. So by the time when they do finally get together, it was kind of anticlimactic. I was like, okay, we've already seen this already. And then we have the other side of the coin of the storyline with Margaret Ives, which initially interested me, but I felt like it was drawn out for so long without that much going on. Like, I fear it did not have enough substance for it to take up so much space in the story. And then there's a kind of twist in the story that is a little wild to a point where it is disproportionate to the stakes of the story set up thus far. I didn't hate this book. I feel like this review is getting a little bit negative. I did enjoy myself a lot in this book, but this was just not her best work, in my opinion, and I gave it 3 stars. Okay, so this next book is going to be an example of me reading a book a long time ago, so now I don't remember a lot of it, and that is Dragonfruit by Makiia Lucier. Not only did I read this a while ago, but I also read it in such a short period of time. It was like a day or two. So it was like in my brain, out the next. But in like a positive way. I had a good time with the story. So this is a YA standalone fantasy based off of Pacific Islander mythology. In this world, sea dragons' eggs, or dragon fruit, are rare and prized possessions because they have the ability to alleviate your greatest sorrows. At the start of our story, Khalilieh is a young attendant to the queen of the island, Tamarind. One day, when she and the queen are both eating their meals, they are poisoned. Luckily, the island is in possession of a dragon fruit, but instead of using the dragon fruit to heal the queen, Khalilieh's father steals the dragon fruit to heal Khalilieh, forcing them now both to live in exile and never return to the island again. Now, years later, the queen is still in a coma, and Sam, the last prince of Tamarind, has 2 choices in front of him. Either he needs to find a girl to marry to become the next matriarch of Tamarind, or he needs to find a cure for his mother. When he ends up crossing paths with Khalilieh, who has since been studying sea dragons and has a clue as to where the next dragon fruit may be, it's the first time that he feels hope for his island. So again, I don't remember a lot about the plot of this book. That took me a while to kind of remember the basic synopsis. But I do remember that I just found this book very lovely. It was such an enjoyable ride. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that it felt so classic YA to me. And by that I mean, there has been a trend in recent years where YA has kind of been geared towards the older portion of YA, the 18 to 21-year-old, if you can even consider that YA. And I feel like we are firmly losing the teen category of like 14 to 16. And that's what this book felt like. Even though the characters are a little older, I think they're like 19 and 20 maybe. The story itself read kind of a little younger. I feel like it could have crossover potential for YA in middle grade. The story itself was just so wholesome. A lot of it really has to do with this idea of homecoming and returning to your community. Khalilieh carries a lot of survivor's guilt because in her living, the queen is now still in a coma and we don't know how long she is going to be able to stay in that state for a while. And so she feels like no one is going to accept her if she does come back to Tamarind. However, the more we get into the story, the more we see just how much that guilt is in her head and that people are a lot more forgiving than they may seem on the outside, especially for a choice that she didn't even make herself. It wasn't her fault that her father stole the dragon egg. I also enjoyed the romance in this book. It wasn't a big part of it, but it was very sweet and wholesome. I did notice, however, especially on Goodreads, that this is being marketed as a romantic fantasy, and I feel like that is not the case. There are certain expectations when you label something as romantasy or even romantic fantasy, and this book was not that. Not to say that the romance wasn't good. I love a good childhood friends to lovers trope, but I just wanted to make that point to set your expectations correctly if you go into this book. I also thought the magic was really cool in this book, and one big part of it had to do with tattoos. If you've seen Moana, the moving tattoos that Maui has on his bodies, it's very similar to that in this book, except that those tattoos materialize into beings. I'm not a huge pet person, but I really liked the animal characters in this book. So overall, I thought it was a really solid standalone fantasy. I gave it 4 stars. The only thing I thought was that it was a little short. I felt like we could have spent a little bit more time with things, could have expanded on certain subjects, but at the same time, I also liked how the story felt a little insular and almost like a folktale. The next 3 books I'm going to be reviewing I'm going to group all together, and that is the Poppy War trilogy by R.F. Kuang, which includes the Poppy War, the Dragon Republic, and the Burning God. I'm certain a lot of you are already familiar with the Poppy War trilogy, and if not, R.F. Kuang's other books, Babel, Yellowface, and now Catabasis most recently. It was actually in preparation for Catabasis coming out that I wanted to read the Poppy War trilogy. Not that it had anything to do with Catabasis, but I'm a completionist at heart and I wanted to have read the entire catalog of R.F. Kuang. So this is an adult historical fantasy novel that is heavily inspired by the Second Sino-Japanese War. We follow a war orphan named Rin who, in an attempt to escape an arranged marriage to a man 3 times her age, decides to study for the annual Keiji exam, which, if she scores well enough, can get her entrance into an academy. And she ends up scoring high enough to enter not only an academy, but the most prestigious military academy in the entire country. There, Rin faces numerous uphill battles and being shunned for being dark-skinned and from a poor province, but she ends up discovering something about herself that truly sets her apart from all the other students, that she has an aptitude for shamanism and has been chosen to be a vessel for the Phoenix God. I think there's a lot more that happens in this series, but it's kind of hard to describe without spoiling anything. It's one of those things where you kind of just need to experience and let the ride take you where it needs to go. But it truly does take you a lot of different places, and a lot of dark places as well. Definitely be sure to read the trigger warnings for this series because it gets quite gruesome, quite dark. And that was basically the extent to what I knew about the series going into it, was that it was very dark and that it broke a lot of people's hearts. But also that nearly everyone has loved it. So I had a lot of high expectations going into the series. And the first book definitely met those expectations and exceeded them in some ways as well. I thought it was excellent. We begin with a really compelling protagonist in Rin, who is highly driven to a almost pathological extent, who will literally stop at nothing to escape the life that has been written out for her. It really sets the tone for the story and where eventually the series is gonna go, but I also liked the more mundane aspects of the first book where we are in a school setting, where we are learning a lot about the history and the magic system. We also have a found family of kind of outcasts and misfits that was really fun to read about. Fun, I mean, in the relative sense, there's still a lot of heartbreaking things going on. But what I really liked about this first book, The Poppy War, was how it was able to execute its tonal change when we go from kind of this more mundane situation to the war. It was sudden, but in a purposeful sense, and in a way that felt very haunting and scary and tragic. In general, I also really like stories where you can kind of feel the passage of time, where you can feel like the character has grown throughout the story and that where they are at the end is very different from where they are in the beginning. Even if not technically a lot of time has passed, it just feels like you've gone on a whole journey with them. And I felt that even within just that first book. So the first book I gave 5 stars, and the second book was not that far off. I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. I felt like I kept a lot of what I enjoyed about the second half of the first book, while also starting to explore more of the political machinations of the world. It also starts to delve more into character relationships, specifically with characters like Katai and Neja. Where I think it fell a little bit in comparison to the first book was in pacing. I felt like in the middle it was starting to draw out a little bit. I got a little bit bored. I appreciate politics, but sometimes it can feel like you are just listening to people talk about things without having a good balance of material events. I honestly would have rated it even a little lower, like about 4 stars, until the last 20% of the book, where things got crazy. What I learned from Babel and now the Poppy War series is that Kuang knows how to end a book. She knows how to make a very explosive end that kind of reworks the entire story. Unfortunately, though, that did not end up applying to the last book of the Poppy War trilogy, The Burning God. I did not like this as much as I wanted to. I didn't not like it. I gave it like 3.5 stars, so it wasn't bad at all. But just given how highly I viewed the first and second book, it was very disappointing and very frustrating. I feel like it started out really good, and I liked the very, very end, like again, the last 20% of the book, but everything in the middle was a little wishy-washy for me. There were a few storylines and specifically world-building plots that I felt like were being set up to be something really big, only to end a little bit anticlimactically or just ended up feeling underutilized. And more than that, I also was kind of disappointed in how R.F. Kuang portrayed the character arcs and relationships. I knew going into this that the Poppy War is not about romance, and that the romance is not going to be the biggest part in the story. I knew that, don't worry. But people still hyped up the romance in this series. So I figured it was the sort of thing where you didn't get a lot of it, but what you did get was really good. And I felt that way through the Dragon Republic. I was like, oh my god, we are setting the stage up for something really beautiful, really tragic, and heartbreaking in the last book. But then I get to the third book, and like, nothing is being done with it. Only very small moments, like crumbs. And what was most frustrating was that the crumbs were good. It wasn't like the whole thing was bad, but it was like you gave me a taste of something, but then you didn't utilize it to its full potential. Again, I know the story is not about the romance, but romance still plays an important part in the overall narrative, both in the character arcs, but also in its metaphorical value to the themes of the story. So I was just a little bit baffled why it was not more brought up to the forefront. This isn't a fully formed thought, but just something that I've noticed is that I feel like even though Art of Kuang has this reputation of being too not subtle, like she kind of slams the messages in your face and doesn't really trust the readers. I don't totally agree with that, but that's besides the point. I feel like when it comes to relationships, she relies a little bit too much on subtlety, where I feel like she could go farther, and I feel like it would elevate the stories more. And by relationships, I also don't mean just romantic, I also mean friendship and familial as well. And that's not to say that there's no emotional or psychological exploration or payoff in the series. That's far from the truth, and the very end of the series definitely got a few tears out of me. Specifically, anything to do with Alton and Rin's relationship with Alton I thought was fantastic and pulled at my heartstrings so much. If you know, you know. But again, because it did some other things very well, it made the parts where it was lacking a little bit more noticeable. Overall, I still view this series very highly. It is an interrogation of power and survival, and really forces you to interrogate the consequences of imperialism and genocide. The last book I have to talk about today is Martyr by Kaveh Akbar. This is a contemporary literary fiction novel about a young poet named Cyrus. When Cyrus was a baby, the plane that his mother was traveling on from Iran was mistakenly shot down by the US government, killing everyone on the plane, including Cyrus's mother. And at the start of the novel, Cyrus's dad has also recently passed away. So now newly orphaned, as well as struggling with depression and alcohol addiction, Cyrus becomes obsessed with the idea of martyrs in history, people whose deaths meant more than their living. Kind of similar to Evil Eye, this is a very introspective book, but kind of in a different way. As you might have guessed from the synopsis, the novel deals very heavily with the philosophy of martyrdom. Cyrus really struggles with finding meaning in his own life, and so turns to these stories of martyrs to try to find some way to see if he can make his death worth something at least. He also kind of questions what makes death meaningful, especially in situations where it feels like there was no meaning or purpose to someone's death, like in the case of his mother, who died because of a mistake that had grave costs to the lives that it affected, but was just kind of a drop in the ocean in the grand scale of American history. As dark as I'm making the book sound, it actually is quite funny. The author has a very funny sense of humor. It's also a really weird book. Like, it really makes use of surrealism and dreams. Throughout the book, we have chapters of Cyrus's dreams, and in these dreams, he has random characters from either different TV shows or movies or celebrities talk to each other about serious things, but again, there is such a humor and silliness to it because it's through the personas of these characters. Like, Lisa Simpson makes an appearance and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar makes an appearance. Like, it's really wacky, but somehow it works. This is a book that I initially had a hard time rating because when I finished the book, I didn't know exactly how to feel about certain things because it deals so much with this weirdness, with surrealism. I just didn't get some things. I was like, I don't know what the author's trying to say here. And it also took me a long time to finish the book. Like, it took me at least a month to read it because it's not the kind of book that really has a plot, so to speak. But at the same time, every time I did pick up the book, I found myself really enjoying it and really being affected by it. I found some passages so profound. And the writing is also beautiful. I kind of had a feeling that would be the case because the author, Kaveh Akbar, is like writing buddies with Tommy Orange, who wrote There, which I also thought had really great writing. But it's the kind of story that I still really think about and I really want to revisit the passages. And for that reason, I landed on like a 4.5 5 stars. Alright, so those are 10 books that I read recently. I still have a lot to catch up on. There are some that I didn't include that I'm going to put in another video. And also, just within October, I read so many books, so I need to catch up on those reviews too. But anyway, please let me know if you've read any of these books, any of your thoughts. If you want to read any of these books, please let me know which ones you're interested in. And please let me know some of your recent reads and what you thought about them in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.